webinar series. Thank you all for joining. Today we will be hearing from Stu Weiss about evaluating canopy structure, light and wind in California's monarch groves from below and above. My name is Jennifer Hill, and I'm a biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center. On behalf of NCTC, we are proud to continue supporting the Monarch joint venture and this webinar series. It's a pleasure to now introduce Katie Lynn Bunny with the Monarch joint venture. Katie Lynn, here's the ball.
Thanks, Jen, and hello, good afternoon, or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you all for joining us. Like Jen said, we're going to hear from Dr. Stu Weiss about canopy structure, light, and wind in the California overwintering groves. I will present today's presenter in just a moment here, but I want to remind everybody that we will be taking questions throughout the webinar. You're welcome to put those into the Q&A box. And this webinar is also being recorded, so you can go back and watch it later and share it with your family, friends, and colleagues if they weren't able to join us live today. So now we'll get started. Stu Weiss received his Ph.D. from Stanford University, and he is the chief scientist at Creekside Science, which is a small outfit providing innovative scientific services for conservation and restoration. His specialties include microclimate assessment, and he has been working on overwintering monarch butterflies since 1990, among many imperiled butterfly and plant species. So before I pass the ball over to Stu, a reminder, you can answer or enter your questions into the Q&A box on the WebEx screen. We will get to your questions at the end of the webinar. And a reminder that this webinar is being recorded so we can share it with a wider audience later. We'll share those resources in a follow-up email later this week. And with that, I will hand things over to Stu. Take it away.
Okay. Balls in my break. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the ways that we evaluate overwintering monarch butterfly habitat in California from below and above. So the western migration is an amazing phenomenon, not nearly the size of the eastern migration, but butterflies that breed all across the western U.S., generally west of the Rockies, end up on the California coast in the winter. And, you know, in comparison with the Mexican sites, where the eastern population goes, you know, in Mexico you get millions or hundreds of millions of individuals in colonies up to several hectares in extent in these high elevation IML fir forests. But in California, they go to the smattering of coastal sites from Mendocino County down into Baja. And these sites are actually pretty small, sometimes on the order of just a few acres. And in California, you know, we'll get 10 monarchs or 10,000 or 100,000 monarchs in a really good place in colonies. And interestingly, they're mostly in non-native eucalyptus forests. There are relatively few stands of native trees right along the coast where the monarchs like to be. But there are some sites. This represents what I'd call the ancestral condition of native Monterey pine forest. This is on Point Lobos State Reserve near Monterey Bay. So, as you're all well aware of, the western monarch population has collapsed. So these are the latest numbers of Thanksgiving counts from Xerxes. 1997, there are estimated to be over 1 million of them, and then it was fluctuating in the 100,000 to 300,000 range. And then in 2018, there was a big collapse, about 30,000, and then it kind of drops off the chart here. I went ahead and replotted it on a logarithmic scale, which is appropriate for populations. Populations work on a logarithmic scale, not an arithmetic scale. So this is really a much better view of the population dynamics. So we can see the severity of the crash from 2017 to 2018, and then from 2019 to 2020. So about 2,000 monarchs were counted along the California coast in over 200 sites. And we can talk at the end about what might have caused it. It's under a lot of scrutiny right now, and we don't really have the answers, but we have a lot of hypotheses. So what are monarchs looking for? Well, they're looking for a place that rarely freezes, which would be right along the immediate coast or the San Francisco Bay. But it can't be too warm, otherwise they burn their fat reserves and break diapause. They need protection from wind, and the threshold's about 2 meters per second, or about 5 miles per hour at ground level. They need sufficient but not too much direct sunlight, which allows thermoregulation in flight. So a dappled light environment is really good with areas of bright sunlight and deep shade close by. And it's really important to have options in heterogeneous habitats as the light and the winds change through time. And as I said, they go from Gualal and Mendocino County down to Baja, primarily in eucalyptus groves, but also we find them with pine, cypress, and other trees and in mixed groves. It's a really interesting phenomenon how the monarchs have adapted to non-native species. So the principles that I like to think about with site design is we need resiliency, a range of conditions to buffer environmental variability. We need redundancy so that the loss of a single branch or tree or other habitat feature will not compromise habitat integrity, i.e. if you have a windbreak, you want 2 versus 1 row of trees. Forests are dynamic, they change through time. Trees die, trees grow, branches fall. It's not a museum piece, and we need to be aware of the dynamism. And we have to get on top of things with proactive adaptive management instead of reactive. So changes are anticipated well in advance, and management is carried out at a deliberate and measured pace as opposed to in the last minute panic. And then lastly, it's really important that any decision making and supervision of restoration activities be done in the field. So I've worked at a lot of sites since 1990. Here's a list of them and the dates that I was been working at. And I'm still working at a lot of them, even after almost 30 years. Lost a few things. Some sites that I'm working in now picked up this year, and there are others in the queue. So what I'm going to do is look pretty closely at a site where we came up with a formal management plan, the Pismo North Campground in Pismo Beach in San Luis Obispo County. The Monarch site is within that red polygon, a small grove of eucalyptus primarily, nestled in between a highway, railroad tracks, suburbia, and a campground. And this has been, really great site in California. Here's some pictures from it from a few years ago. Tens of thousands of people come by, probably even above 100,000 come by to visit the monarchs in a given year. But like the rest of the monarch population, it totally collapsed in recent years, especially in 2020, where the Thanksgiving count came up with 200 butterflies in a place that used to support 20,000 regularly. So that's like 2 orders of magnitude drop. And this photo that I took in November shows a good fraction of monarch population at Pismo, and even a good fraction of the California population as a whole. So when we look a little closer, we can see where the trees are. We have the eucalyptus trees on either side of the highway. The little circles are trees that were mapped out by state park staff. East of the highway is a grove of trees along the Union Pacific Tract, and they're very, very important. I'll talk a bunch about those later. And as you can see, on one side, there's a suburban development. There's an open campground. The highway goes right by it. So there's a lot going on in a really small area here. So the first thing we like to do in a site is get a good tree map, so we know, the size and species of the trees. And you can see here in that light blue, that bluish green, the vast majority of the trees here are blue gum eucalyptus, but there are some Monterey cypress and a few other species. And some of the trees are actually rather large, over a meter in diameter breast height. So it's a pretty old grove. There's a parking area and an open field being restored to native coastal scrub habitat. So the technique that I've been using since the early 1990s is called hemispherical photography. It's an 8mm lens mounted on gimbal, so it's pointed straight up, self-levels, and it's oriented so that we know where north is in the photograph. You can see I'm holding onto the compass there. And for those of you with sharp eyes, that is a large stand of poison oak in the background there. Unfortunately, a lot of California sites are dominated by poison oak in the understory, which makes life a little difficult for doing field work, but not Pismo. And this was published, the technique was first published in 1991. So here's how we analyze the photograph. We get it lined up so we know where north is. We overlay on this sky grid. So this is a grid that has, it's divided into 8 azimuth wedges, directional wedges, and those are divided into rings of 4 to 5 degrees elevation angle or zenith angle. And what the program called HemiView does is it counts up the pixels in each of the sections and calculates how open each of those segments are. So the north, which is up at the top, we look at that wedge, you can see 43% of the sky. So let me step back for a second. Overall, we can see 23% of the sky here. Now, in the north direction, we can see 43% of it. We go down to the south, you can only see 11% of the sky. So we use those as an index of wind exposure. And here's a much denser site. And here, the most open sector is to the north. About 26% of the sky is visible. And then on the east sector, which is the left, only 3% of the sky is visible. So the basic principle here is the more open it is, the easier the wind gets in. And here we can only see 12% of the sky. We can also calculate solar radiation by superimposing on the geometrically determined sun paths. So at the bottom of the grid, there's the December 21st sun path, and then November and October. And the same principle is involved. We count up the open sky pixels in each of those sectors and then weigh it by the clear sky radiation coming in. So we come up with a really good measurement of solar radiation potential under clear skies, and then we can even look at different times of day, morning, midday, and afternoon, because monarchs do have some preferences for where they like to be in the morning and where they like to be in the afternoon. So here are some photos from Pismo, taken out of the report, which is available. I've highlighted, this first photograph, 2442, is taken adjacent to the highway. You can see the power lines overhead, and then we can see those trees by the railroad tracks. I refer to them as the Union Pacific trees over there on the left of the photograph. And then majority of the grove is over on the right side and to the north, which is the top of the photo. The next photo, we've moved over a little bit away from the highway. You can see those trees, the Union Pacific trees, are a little smaller, and the main grove is a little bit closer. We get into the interior of the grove. You can see how that large gap to the south in the top two photos is now getting blocked by trees. And then this lower right is right underneath the cluster site at that point. And that is a lot more closed in, has good wind shelter from almost all directions. You can see there's relatively little open sky in most directions there. So that's those are some raw fisheye photos. I took an irregular grid within the took photos on an irregular grid within the site, making sure I hit the high points, the bright spots, the dark spots, kind of like topographic mapping. It's very efficient to do it that way. And those white circles are where the monarch clusters have been, and the two smaller ovals are the most recent cluster areas. So if we look and we see what this ISFU, which is the visible sky, what range the cluster sites are in, we see they're between about 0.15 and 0.30, so not the darkest spots, not the densest spots, and not the most open spots. And coincidentally, from that 1991 conservation biology paper, we get about the same range here, shown by the range along the ISF axis here, with the orange bar showing a range between about 0.15 and 0.30, and that's pretty typical range we find across almost all monarch sites. So this intermediate canopy density is really important. But then we can drill down and look at the solar radiation, because we know the monarchs like to be in well-lit spots so they can thermoregulate. So here's a series of maps, October, November, and December, and then it's symmetrical around the solstice, so January, February, and March going back. I can see how well the high radiation in the warm colors in the open areas, and then as we get into the grove, see it's greatly attenuated, and that the cluster sites are in slightly better lit areas, more radiation compared to the forests around them. And you can see how it gets less radiation as we go further into the season towards the winter solstice. And then down at the bottom is an overall measure of annual solar radiation, just a standard output of fisheye photography. Now, the wind is what really drives the monarchs around in sight and out of sight. So here's some wind roses for a nearby airport to Pismo, and we can see during the season that prevailing northwest winds, but then as we get into November and December and January and into February, we get a lot of southeast winds that are associated with winter storms. And if we look a little bit closer at this is the January wind rose, you can see the colors of the wind speed, and you can see on that southeast vector there, that's going towards the lower right. There's that little bar of the bright blue, which are the really high wind speeds, over 11.06 meters per second, which is on the order of 25 miles per hour. And those are with the storm winds that can really blow out the monarchs from wind-exposed sites. We've seen that happen numerous times over the years in sites that don't have good wind protection. So then we can make a map of the wind shelter here. So again, the warmer colors are more exposed to the wind. The cooler colors, getting to the dark blue, are the most wind-sheltered spot where you can see less than 10% of the sky in those directions. So our two cluster sites are there well within the blue and the darker green from almost all directions here, with northwest wind, prevailing wind, good shelter from the trees to the northwest. And then we get down to the southeast at the lower right. We can see how that big open field is very open to the winds, but the cluster sites themselves, especially that upper right cluster site, is very well sheltered from the southeast. Really, really important component of the habitat quality here. So the monarchs can stay at the site when we get really strong winter storms because they have this little nook in the canopy to be sheltered from the winds. So the sites themselves, so the site is providing really high quality habitat. We have well-lit wind-sheltered spots within it, and that's why the monarchs stick it out here over the entire winter. But not all of the key habitat is owned by state parks. We have neighbors. We have the Union Pacific Railroad across Highway 1, and there's a double row of eucalyptus trees that are to the southeast of the state park and the cluster site. So they can play a really, really important role in providing the wind shelter. So we went ahead and asked ourselves, what would it look like if those trees weren't there? So the beauty of the fisheye photography is that we can modify the photos. So I went into Photoshop and I pulled out what I call the chainsaw tool, and I cut down all of the trees across the highway by the Union Pacific tracks. And so you can see the difference. You can see how much more open it became in the right-hand photo. And then when we do the wind site factor analysis, the black line is the current condition, so about 25%, 0.25 for the southeast. But then when we take out the trees, it goes up to greater than 0.5, which is too wind exposed. So the quality of the monarch habitat on this site is utterly utterly dependent on those trees across the highway that are off the site. So we have to look at the broader context, and that means that state parks who are trying to manage this, like, have to have good relationships with the neighbors. Elsewhere along that grove, a little to the north, some trees were removed without any warning, pretty much. Fortunately, they were far enough away that they didn't open up a lot of the wind. But there are all kinds of hazards involved along those lines of what the neighbors do. So this was all brought together in a site management plan that was published in October 2020. This is available online from the Xerxes website. And on the right here is a map showing kind of tree planting areas. So we have these areas right along the highway here where we're going to reinforce the in situ trees on the state park property to create more wind shelter just in case something happens out here, and then creating a shelter belt here in Area C, which is the long skinny one, to create further wind shelter from the south and southeast in the main part of the grove. And these are very detailed plans that were made for tree planting. And it's always nice when you come up with a plan and it gets implemented. So here we are in looking at the newly planted Monterey cypress in the shelter belt. The trees in the background are the eucalyptus along the Union Pacific track. So they planted a really nice double row, staggered row of Monterey cypress that will eventually grow up. They grow about 2 or 3 feet per year, so it'll be a while. We'll create a nice shelter belt. And then we had a bit of a struggle with the state parks policies about planting non-native trees like eucalyptus. But because we're within an existing eucalyptus footprint and several major trees were lost, we were able to make the argument that we could plant 4 of them in key spots, which was actually a pretty big deal of changing state parks, California State Parks policy on management of non-native vegetation. So, there are management plans being developed for a lot of different sites. Another site that worked at recently is at Andrew Malera State Park, the small eucalyptus grove in beautiful coastal environment in the Big Sur region in Monterey County. That's the mouth of the Big Sur River, flows right by the site. There it is from looking back towards the Santa Lucia Mountains, and then the eucalyptus grove is centered around this Cooper cabin, which was built in 1861, which was when the trees were planted as a windbreak. And that's Jeff Frey on the right of California State Parks and Chris Schwinn, one of my Creekside staff. So Andrew Malera has, been a pretty consistent site for time. And it went way down in 2018 and 2019, kind of commensurate with the rest of the California population. And as of January, I believe there were 20 monarchs. This year, there were 20 monarchs there. I had done an assessment of this site back in 2001. So we can take a kind of a long-term view of what's changed at the site. This is an example of a wind analysis using a slightly different graphic design, but I don't want to go into the details of that. So what I was able to do is line up photographs from 2001 and then 19 years later in 2020 and see how have things changed. So in 2001 at this site, you can see there's a lot of open sky, and if we go over to 2020, we can see the growth of trees and the encroachment of trees in that upper right quadrant. We can see trees have grown in quite a bit and are blocking off a lot more of the sky. I can turn that into how did the wind exposure change, which is this first graph here. The blue is 2001 and the orange is the 2020. So you can see there's actually quite a bit more wind shelter in 2020 than there was back in 2001. But we've also lost a lot of the light environment here. So across all these measures here, the orange bar is lower than the blue bar, and we've lost, in some cases, half of the available light. And then if we look at the month by month, you can see that it's considerably darker. So it's been a lot of change in 20 years, and it's like, well, trees grow, and eucalyptus grow pretty fast. Here's the site where they were clustering back in 2001. You can see that it's very open to the south, and they'd be clustering in this tree directly above us. Well, in 2020, there's so much tree growth in that area that the light has been almost completely blocked out. So we end up with increase in wind shelter, but a huge decrease in light, especially here in the winter months. So the site is really closed in over time. So here the prescription really is to let's open it up a bit and get it back to where it was back in, closer to what it was in 2001, with a few important caveats. So state park staff did a heroic job weeding through the poison oak in the understory to create a tree map. And then we can see, here's the DBH distribution. You can see how many small trees from 5 to 20-inch DBH are in this stand. So the prescription here, I'm calling it the first cut tree removals, is to thin out the forest in the center part of the grove while maintaining the wind shelter from the trees around. So all the pink trees there are these relatively smaller trees that hopefully, well, we're planning on removing. There's about 55 of them. And then the gray trees are remaining, so they'll still be there for the monarchs. And then there's another set of trees we're recommending removal, the blue trees over there in the lower right. And those are trees that are starting to encroach into the riparian zone of the Big Sur River, and we need to protect those against, we need to protect the river corridor against invasion by eucalyptus. So we're trying to balance a lot of different, several different resource management aims here. So this plan is still in development. And just to give you a sense of the kind of trees we're going to be taking out are these pole-sized trees that came in the last 20 years. So we're going to be keeping the large trees and taking out a lot of the smaller trees that have been in. And I think they were really cool looking photographs that give you a real sense of how densely the eucalyptus trees can grow in a place like this. Okay, so that's from below. Now we're going to take a look from above using LiDAR. This is actually a view of Andrew Molera done in a rendered in a style I like to call 19th century Japanese woodblock prints. For you art aficionados, you'll recognize that. Really cool imagery, but I'm going to show you how we can get a lot of good quantitative information about this. So the place where we're most advanced on this is up at Bodega Bay in Sonoma County at the northern part of the range. There are 3 sites in this area from the Xerces database. Going to start off at the Bodega Dunes Campground and Ranch Road, which is actually 2 sites right adjacent to each other, but they really function as one site. The campground is owned by California State Parks, and the Ranch Road, which is the lower polygon in that aerial photograph, is a California Department of Fish and Wildlife ecological preserve that was specifically bought for the monarch butterfly at that site. Zooming in on the Dunes Campground, the orange circle there is the quote, traditional site where most of the clustering took place. Unfortunately, the last significant clustering took place here in 1997, and that was back when there were over 1 million monarchs in California. So we get a few strays coming through, but you know, this site has not been used for a really long time. But it's still worth assessing, because at the northern end of the range, it might well be the where the monarchs will go under climate change. So if we zoom in on that area, you can see some of the campground infrastructure. You can see Monterey cypress trees, eucalyptus, and the area that I call the alcove, which is where the cluster site is. The monarchs would be around the edge, the trees on the edge of that. So our methods, we take GIS layers. We have a LiDAR map from the Sonoma Bench Map project, flown in 2013, but things haven't changed that much since then. We processed the LiDAR to make a canopy model, and then we run solar radiation on the outer canopy envelope. Then we run a wind ninja, I'll talk about that, on the outer canopy envelope, wind in 8 directions. We do an overlay, and I'm headed up later this month or early next month to do hemispherical photography from below. So here's kind of what the LiDAR looks like. We have the this is a canopy density model. So we can see we have very dense canopies where the trees are, and of course where the trees aren't, we don't have any forest canopy. And it's shot at about 8 to 12 points per square meter. So we're getting a pretty high resolution on the canopy structure. Stepping back a little bit, again, here's a 3D view of it. The black circle is that little alcove. And, you know, just to kind of get a sense of the place here. So here's kind of the solar radiation modeling that we do. So here's the site itself with the aerial photography. We have a canopy surface. This is the outer canopy surface measured with the LiDAR, and we run a solar radiation model on that in ArcGIS. So here's the daily insolation in December. We can see the red is the highest values, the blue are the lowest values, and the light white are in between values. So you can see this. There's a lot of light in this gap, in this little alcove here. We can also look at in the morning. We're getting more radiation on the northwestern side of the gap. Midday is pretty well distributed around the gap. And then in the afternoon, we're getting it on the eastern side of the gap. Afternoon radiation is often where well-lit areas are where the monarchs will roost after they've been active during the day. And then we can do the same, take a look at the entire area here and see, where the well-lit areas are and where the dark areas are at different times of the day. So we can really nail down the light environment here. Then we can do wind. There's a program called Wind Ninja, and you have to have the right wardrobe to sit down and use this. So it takes great intercom and the right set of robes. It models wind across surfaces. It solves the fluid dynamic equations and is developed by the Fire Lab in Missoula, U.S. Forest Service. And it's used operationally on fires, so it's pretty solid. What you do is define the wind speed and direction, and we're assuming a solid outer surface, so it's really only good for relative exposure at the canopy surface, not so much within the canopy. That's where the fisheye photography plays a huge role. And we find the monarchs are usually near the canopy surface, so it's a really good first approximation of relative wind exposure. So if we look from all the different wind directions, northwest, northeast, southeast, southwest, the dark circle is the alcove we've been looking at. We can see generally it's got blue colors on it, which means it's pretty well wind sheltered from all directions. And then the center is, I just took the maximum wind exposure, so because we can get strong winds from any direction. So if you're sheltered from all directions, then you're in much better shape than if you have to move around and be driven by the wind away from the site. And then the other two circles are other historic cluster sites, and you can see the white one is pretty well wind sheltered. It also has good solar radiation. The yellow one actually is a little more wind exposed, especially from the southeast and from southerly directions. And it turns out that that's where the monarchs historically would cluster more inside the forest, not so much hanging on the edges. So again, we have this combination of light and wind that are defining suitable habitat for monarchs. Here's just the maximum wind exposure looking at the three sites. So the leftmost one is the alcove we've been looking at, and the center one is actually very well wind sheltered. And then the surface along Ranch Road, the rightmost one, is relatively wind exposed, but you can see a little bit of blue when you get into one of the nooks and crannies of the site. So this is a work in progress here. So we have the assessments. We'll be doing the fisheye photography. Let's look at another site here. This is on the Bodega Marine Lab property, kind of southwest of the campground site. And this is a really interesting site because it's not really a big eucalyptus forest. It's actually a gully dominated by willows with a few eucalyptus trees in it. Here's a photograph of what it looks like when we bashed through the understory. It's a really dense stand of willows, and then that's a lone eucalyptus tree sticking out above it. So we take the LiDAR, we can differentiate the canopy surface from vegetation from the ground, and the blue are is the tall vegetation. Then we turn that into a surface, and here we're running the solar radiation model. In this angle, north is to the lower right. So we can see that the south-facing side of the gully is very well lit, not surprisingly. The north side is pretty shady. This is the December solar radiation, so we have well-lit areas. And then we run Wind Ninja on it, and we see we have really good shelter from the northwest, which would be to the upper right. Moving below, it's pretty well sheltered from the southwest and from the southeast, especially in those well-lit areas on the south-facing side of the gully. But our northeast wind exposure is a bit problematic because that's the direction that the gully opens to. So this site was used much more temporarily back when it was used, and not much to do in terms of management here. So we've been able to evaluate it. Then we can, the power of the LiDAR is that we don't necessarily need the ground access to do the evaluation. So here's like 3122, which is right by the marina, and it's actually a lot of small parcels, residential neighborhood. And, you can't just go tromping around in people's yards, but we can do an evaluation. So the LiDAR elevation map, we have the maximum wind. We can see that there are wind sheltered spots, not at the top of the canopy, but as you go down a little bit. And then we have a lot of well-lit spots that, in the red, that actually coincide quite nicely with some of the wind-sheltered spots. So here's a way of evaluating sites from a distance. So this is all a work in progress. We're building on decades of work, and we're starting to come up with a lot of site management plans. And I want to thank the collaborators on these various projects. The Xerxes Society, California State Parks, the Wildlife Conservation Board in California funded the local resource conservation district for doing a lot of monarch work, and a lot of the sites I'm working at are funded via that and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So we're addressing the overwintering sites, but there are problems elsewhere in the life cycle that are going to need to get fixed before we can see the return of large clusters of monarch butterflies. So thank you. That's it. I think I'll answer some questions now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stu. That was really, really interesting. So we'll head into our question and answer period now. Thank you all for listening and submitting your questions. Feel free to continue entering questions that you have into the Q&A window. A reminder, we did record today's webinar, so if you want to share it with your friends, family, colleagues, or come back and watch it again, it will be available online to watch on both the MJV and the NCTC websites in about 2 weeks. We will also follow up today after today's webinar with some additional resources and a short survey for you to complete to share any feedback. We would love to hear from you. We might not get to all of the questions that were asked throughout the webinar, but we will get to as many as possible. So to start, Stu, somebody was wondering, does the computer program note any tunneling effects because of longitudinal gaps?
What kind of effect?
Tunneling.
Oh, tunneling effect. Yeah, if there is a gap that shows up from the ground surface to the top of the canopy, Wind Ninja will pick that up, and you'll see that there's a pretty strong wind exposure coming in there. But because we're modeling the outer canopy surface, that's where the LiDAR Wind Ninja combination kind of falls down, and that's why doing the fisheye photography from below captures those below canopy gaps. So that's why we need to look at it from above and from below.
And then on the subject of eucalyptus, I know there's some controversy surrounding eucalyptus as a tree in California. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the controversy surrounding that and why, especially for those of us who don't live in California and may not fully understand it. And then somebody was also wondering if planting eucalyptus trees in Prescott, Arizona would help the monarch, or if that's something that should be avoided.
Okay. So, yeah, the eucalyptus controversy has been dogging us a lot in California. So eucalyptus were introduced into California in the 1800s, and they planted a lot of groves along the coast as wind shelter, and these groves kind of took off, started reproducing on their own, and when they got large enough, they developed the right canopy structure that the monarchs started finding them, and they just moved in for overwintering. The ancestral condition was just a few coastal pine forests in the Monterey Peninsula and a little further south, were probably where the monarchs went to, but now they've spread out into sites from San Diego up to Sonoma County in the eucalyptus groves primarily. My attitude is that the monarchs have made their choice, and we have to work with it and honor it. And balancing the management of eucalyptus groves for monarchs within a specified footprint, and then keeping the eucalyptus from overrunning really nice, pristine coastal habitats, that's the balancing act. And that's what we were addressing down at the Andrew Malera site, and we're addressing it elsewhere. So a lot of these sites just came into existence by sheer accident, and now we have an opportunity to more deliberately design them. So again, the monarchs made their choice, and we have to work with it. We'll talk a lot more about the eucalyptus issue, and we did make a little bit of headway with the State Parks Department in being able to plant a few trees. And eucalyptus provide great monarch habitat. They are actually very plastic, so we'll push shoots into open areas and seal up gaps around the edges. They create a really nice, varied canopy structure that I really like.
So in terms of planting them in Arizona where they're also not native.
Well, Prescott, Arizona is not monarch overwintering habitat. This is just strictly for overwintering monarchs. And so they wouldn't serve that function in Prescott, Arizona.
Right. Okay, and you were talking about balance with the eucalyptus trees. Would you be able to elaborate too on what, based on your research, you would consider are optimal conditions, finding that balance between having protection from the wind, but also having enough light showing through so that it's not too cold. Do you have any indication on what that optimal balance would be?
Yeah, well, now that we're working with so many sites, I can start getting a signature based on inter and intra-site comparisons of places where they are and where they're not. So I can't give you an exact answer right now, but so far we know that having that overall visible sky between about 15 and 30%, probably a little bit more around the 15 to 25%, and that a lot of the canopy cover is to the sides where it's sheltered. You're getting wind shelter, but there's enough of a light gap. So, I can kind of do it. I can walk into an area and just by having seen so many of these sites, I'm pretty good at saying that, oh, here's where they must have been clustering. And I'm more often right than wrong there because there is a real signature and we haven't completely nailed it down yet, but we're working on it.
Yeah, it's tricky. And there were two questions kind of related to this. So, you've had the opportunity to monitor several sites over the years. Firstly, have you seen site conditions deteriorate in some of them? And then secondly, do you think that would be a contributing factor to the decline of monarchs that we've seen in the West? So, how has the condition of the overwintering sites or has it correlated to the decline of
right? So, yeah. Okay. So first, yes, a lot of sites have changed a lot. Often a lot of sites have had trees removed for they get developed. There are a lot on private land, and so just even in the absence of that level of human disturbance, we have the just natural wind throw can take out some trees. So we've seen sites that have become too open because of the loss of trees. We also have seen sites that have gotten too dense, like the Andromolera site, where we need to open it up a little bit. So I'm working at a few sites where we're planning on opening up the canopy by removing selected trees, similar to what we did at Andromolera, while maintaining the wind shelter around the edges. So every site is really quite unique, and that's why we need to have pretty site-specific management plans that take into account the idiosyncrasies of all the sites. Some sites have burned up in some of the fires. There are just dozens and dozens of sites across the state. The ones that I feel like are the most precious are the few remaining that are in native Monterey pine forests, which I know too. So those are areas we would never think about planting eucalyptus. But in areas where there are eucalyptus already in the monarch estate, we really need to manage those forests. One of the big issues is that eucalyptus will drop branches, and other trees will too. So maintaining the safety via hazard tree management is a really big deal in a lot of these groves where you get tens of thousands of people coming through. So a lot of balancing acts going on. And again, every site has its own idiosyncrasy.
Nature doesn't always like to follow its own rules. And then when humans come in and mess with things, it makes it even more complicated.
Yeah. And we're dealing with, already kind of quote non-natural situations, and trying to maintain this phenomena within a few acres. So, we have to work with what we have. Not to say we shouldn't be interplanting some, say, Monterey cypress. Monarchs seem to like that. They can cling on to that a little easier than the eucalyptus. We would love to be able to use Monterey pines, but Monterey pines are susceptible to a disease called pitch canker, and we have no guarantee that they'll be around in coming decades if you plant them. So there's a lot of constraints here.
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated issue, and working to find that balance is something that we can all strive for as conservation professionals. It is 1 minute past the hour, so I'll have to end our Q&A there. But I want to thank Stu again for sharing his time and his research with us. And thank you to NCTC for hosting the webinar, and to all of you for participating. We hope to see you for our next webinar on February 23rd. We'll be hearing about the beauty and the resilience of prairies. You can find the registration for that on the Monarch Joint Venture website, and we'll be sharing it out on social media in the coming weeks as well. Thank you all again, and we will see you next time.
Okay.